Okay, hello everybody. I'm Jamie Druckman, Associate Director of IPR, and I am given the honor and the privilege to stand in for Sally Numa, who was planning the introduction but unable to. Emergency came up and unable to do it. So I'm going to read her introduction, which is a lovely one. So this is Tabitha Bonilla, who is a professor and IPR fellow in CESP. Her work sits at the intersection of political communication, representation, identity, and political behavior. Her work addresses significant topics in American politics, including questions of race, human trafficking, gun control, and immigration. Tabitha has articles published or forthcoming in top political science outlets, including the American Political Science Review and the Journal of Politics. In addition, she has recently released an extraordinary book, and I'll second that it's an extraordinary book, with Cambridge University Press, The Importance of Campaign Promises, where she investigates how voters perceive promises made by elected officials and its impacts on their political opinions. Tabitha received her BA from MIT in political science and biology, and a PhD in political science from Stanford. And beginning next academic year, Tabitha will have officially been promoted to the rank of associate professor in human development and social policy here at Northwestern. So please join me and Sally in congratulating Tabitha on this recent milestone and welcoming her to present her research on descriptive and substantive representation with the IPR community. Thanks, Tabitha.
Thanks to Jamie and Sally for that kind introduction. So I'm on the handheld mic today, and so you might see me fumbling because sometimes I forget not to move. So if you can't hear, just let me know and I will adapt as needed. But thank you both for that lovely introduction. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be presenting this project. It's pretty new, so there may be lots of questions and lots of pieces that I'm still connecting together. So it's also partly why I'm really excited to be here today with this, so that I can kind of hear how everybody is processing my processing of this new data. And I also want to acknowledge that much of the work on this project is done in conjunction with my co-author, Amber Spry, who is an assistant professor of political science and African American studies at Brandeis University, and who does amazing work on identity and also in particular how we measure identity with survey research. So it's really a pleasure to kind of get to add that to the way that I've been thinking about representation. So I think very broadly, I kind of wanted to just start with like the questions I ask and why I think they're important to a policy audience. And they all center around this main question of what do audiences understand, and particularly public audiences, understand about policy from candidate communication. And I ask this in two veins. So first, what does the public understand about representation when candidates communicate? And secondly, what does it mean for political mobilization when we hear these communications, and how, particularly when leadership diverges from public understanding? So this is kind of the work that I do on Black Lives Matter and human trafficking and immigration. But the work that I'm talking about today really stems from my book, which was just released, which was a way to kind of conceptualize how voters are understanding promises and what they're doing with them, and particularly how they're responding to them. And so the main contribution of this book, I think, is to place voters at the center of the analysis of representation, because for much of the literature and much of the discourse, what we're doing is trying to understand what candidates and elected officials are doing. And my question, what I want to do, is to say, what do voters understand? And how do they think about what representation means? And in particular, I want to ask this question of how voters are understanding these candidate communications around policy prospectively. So not just after they've elected an official and that person has had a chance to vote on it and work on it, but before, while they're making that decision to vote, because this is how we start to tap into how voters are understanding the process of policy change, and how they are going to make their decisions in the ballot box. So in this line of work, I have two sets of questions. And the main one is, how do candidate appeals shift voter attitudes in the context of identity? So I'm curious first and foremost about how voters understand promises that are directly about their group. This becomes really important, particularly in the current political climate, where I think we've all heard news stations and pundits talk about how Latinx constituents are going to vote, or how Black voters are going to vote, and how these key groups might switch outcomes of elections, right? So I'm curious about those appeals. But what I'm focusing on today is this question of how descriptive representation works with or against substantive representation. So I'll define those in just a moment. But what I'm really curious is how these candidate communications matter for how individuals understand the ways in which their issues are going to be represented, and particularly how identity interacts with those issues. And not just the identity of the voters, but the identity of the candidates as well. I'm curious what this means for how these voters think about their own representation, about the group's representation at large, and then finally about their expectations around the issue itself. So what will happen to policy based on the convergence of all these factors? Okay, so here's how I'm going to organize the talk. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about representation, about what I think it means and why I think we should care about these little divergences between theory and empirics. I'm going to propose an extension of the theory from my first book, thinking about representation as a commitment and how that matters for descriptive representation. And then I'm going to talk about the results of 3 different studies. So I have some descriptive survey results, an experimental survey experiment that I'll present, and then a few interviews that I'll start to talk about. Depending on time, I might be able to go into them more or less. Okay, so the study of representation is a really key feature of the way that we think about democracies and what democracies are doing for individual voters and for policy at large. And there's a lot of different conceptions of representation, and it gets a little bit complex weighing through them. So I'm just going to kind of give you the top lines that I think are important without going really deep into the details. But these conceptions of representation often contrast candidates and issues with group representation. So there tends to be a divide between what we think is happening for representation based on policy and what we think is happening based on identity. And there's this really big gap in political science theory on this. So Pitkin in 1967 presents probably the first nicely structured set of representation theories. I'm going to talk about Jane Mansbridge's, which she proposes in 1999, which carries through 2 really similar tenets. Each of these different theorists divide representation into 4 different types of representation. And the pieces that I care about, I've listed them all out just for completeness, but I'm not going to talk about them all. The pieces that I care about are really the 2 that are mentioned here. So the first type of representation we might think of as promissory representation, or it's sometimes thought of as or described as substantive representation. And this is really representation that's based entirely on the issues themselves. So do voter views align with what candidates are talking about as they're going to implement policy? And there's additional pieces on accountability here. So whether or not voters are able to hold those elected officials accountable based on what these promises were when they're campaigning. And so that's the piece that's really about the issues. But there's a second type of representation, which Mansbridge calls gyroscopic representation. Pitkin calls descriptive representation. And that label, the descriptive representation, is the one that the field really attends to. But both of these types of representation are based on what we might think of as shared values due to a shared identity. So an internal guidance that a candidate will do or an elected official will do what's right because they share the same values as a particular constituent. And I like Mansbridge's metaphor here of gyroscopic representation, which is really thinking about as a gyroscope spins, it's held in alignment based on that center guiding axis. And so really it's this internal motivation to act as though someone is a representative of their group and they're going to enact things based on their group membership. Now, often this is interpreted in the field as representation for African Americans, Latinx groups, and sometimes women, but it's also applied broadly. So we'll see this in comparative literature, looking at other countries. And so it's really interpreted not simply based on gender or race and ethnicity, but based on a shared experience, even though often in the US it's interpreted as an ascriptive identity. And so that is definitely how I'm going to be talking about it today. What's interesting about these theoretical conceptions of representation is that they're a little bit dismissive of what descriptive representation is doing, who it's for, and what it can do. So even as Hannah Pitkin defines representation and descriptive representation and says it's doing important things, she also says that this view that we've been discussing doesn't actually allow for the activity of representing. It doesn't allow for room for creative activities of a representative legislature, the forging of consensus, the formulating of policy, or the activity we roughly design by governing. Representing here can at most mean typical or resembling, right? So there's this notion that descriptive representation isn't actually the type of democratic good that it should be because of this problem of accountability. And Mansbridge, in her conception of descriptive representation, actually echoes the same type of view. So even though these representatives are acting like gyroscopes, as in the other models of representation introduced here, these representatives are not accountable to their electors in any traditional sense. Thus, their accountability is only to their own beliefs and principles. And I think what this means is that we've kind of placed descriptive representation in its own bucket and kind of ignored it in mainstream theories of representation and let other subfields, race and ethnic politics, really carry on the work of what descriptive representation is doing and kind of ignored it in our mainstream theory making. And so the piece that I want to push on in this project is actually to ask, are these theoretical conceptions actually correct? Is this really what we're seeing when we talk about descriptive representation? Or might there be a better way to theorize around what descriptive representation might be doing? I think the other way that we see encounters with descriptive representation is to start then asking questions about what it means to be a good descriptive representative. And this leads to questions a little bit about group policing, who belongs, how well they belong, and what type of representative they are for their group, which also sets us up to an interesting type of research question that I think is also distinct from the question that I'm asking today. And I think we can kind of push beyond if we want. So there's several empirical contributions that the field has made about descriptive representation to show why it's important and what it means. And the first thing that we know is that when we think about descriptive representation as being particularly meaningful for historically ignored and historically ignored groups, so theorizing it around Black and Latinx individuals and women, we start to think that descriptive representation is, in fact, actually pretty small portion of the types of representation available. So this is an image from the Collective Political Action Committee. So it's a PAC that centers around the election of Black candidates. And I like the graphic because it's really pulling on these descriptive representation pieces, showing us that of all the people in the US Senate, we have 68 white men, 21 white women, a handful of Latinx people, 3 Black men, 2 Asian women. And of course, given what the PAC is doing, they want to really point out that there are just no Black women in the Senate. We might also point out that there are no Asian men in the Senate, or no Native American men or women, or non-binary identifying individuals in the Senate, right? So there's a lot of types of representation that we don't see. So if we're thinking about descriptive representation as being meaningful for members of historically disadvantaged groups, there's really not a lot of it. Here's some more data from another PAC. This one's the Latino Victory Fund, right? They're really trying to make this point. People were not being represented. So there are 5 different kinds of offices listed on the x-axis on the bottom. The blue bars are offices that are held by Latinx elected officials, and the gray bars are majority Latino districts, right? And so we can see that except for the state, and this is data from 2019, so it's a little bit outdated, but by and large, Latinx individuals are not represented by descriptive representative. And this is largely true for any member of a historically disadvantaged group. Okay, so that's the first thing we know, that there's not a lot of descriptive representation unless we're, particularly if we're thinking about, apologies, I didn't turn my phone off. Okay, the second thing we know is that descriptive representation is actually pretty important for members of historically excluded groups because it does things like increase turnout where there are descriptive representatives. So this is data, I think this is from, I forget the name, it's on the bottom. Okay, so this is data from a paper from 2010, so it's also a little bit old. On the left, we have data for Black individuals. On the right, we have data for Latinx individuals. And then each of the figures on that x-axis is the percent number of the group in the state legislature. And on the y-axis is the probability of voting. So in the first figure, so the darker line or the top line on each of them, I guess it's hard to differentiate on the screen. Sorry about that. So the top line on both of them are those who are represented by a co-racial or co-ethnic identifier. And on the bottom are those who are not. So you can see that in each case, having a descriptive representative increases your likelihood to turn out to vote, right? And so I don't want to talk about endogeneity, but there's a relationship between participation politically and having a descriptive representative. It also does something for policy. So where there are descriptive representatives, we also find that policy tends to shift more positively in favor of people who are being descriptively represented. So I won't go into the data, but there's some studies looking at the increases both of the availability and the amounts of welfare in districts that have higher percentages of Latinx representatives. And then similarly on the right, there's some data about Black interest as they've been coded by this research team. And in each case, right, where there are more descriptive representatives, we're seeing more policy goods for those Black and Latinx groups. I'll just say a caveat. I told you that women were another group for whom descriptive representation has been both measured empirically and theorized. I'll say that the results for women as a group are a little bit mixed. We do see evidence of some policy good provisions, but there's debate on context and reasons why that might exist. And I won't go into all of that, except to say that one key difference, particularly for African-American voters, is that there's a united political perspective, right? So African-American voters have many more shared political outcomes than do either Latinx voters, and particularly women. And there's a lot of theorizing on why this is for women. So I recommend looking at Angie Maxwell and Todd Shields' book. Jane June has some really important analysis on why we see these variations among women. So I'm kind of just gonna skip over that today. But it is a really interesting line of work. Okay, so what I told you I wanted to get at is this contrast between what we're seeing in the theory and what we're seeing in the empirical research. And I think Amber and I both wanted to kind of push on this idea that while on one hand, descriptive representation is supposed to stand apart from substantive representation, what we're really seeing is some important shifts around representation. When we see descriptive representations, we're seeing policy shifts and policy goods happening. And so what we're seeing is that even as we're researching what descriptive representation means, we're actually very often talking about substantive representation. And so there's an overlap and an intersection of these two types of representation that we think needs to have a little bit more theory around it. Okay, and so this kind of takes me back to the argument that I'm making in my first book. And the whole sum of the argument is that decisions on who people want to vote for are based often on commitments, what voters feel is important. And very often this is about policy because voters want to know that their representatives are going to enact their interests when they're in office, right? And so for those of you who have political theory in the background, I think that this closely follows on Burke's version of delegate representation, which, if you notice, is very much in contrast to both Mansbridge and Pitkin, who tried to argue that descriptive representation is based solely on this trustee representation. Okay, so back for everyone else. What I'm trying to argue is that voters are looking for evidence that candidates are going to be committed to enact their issues in office, writ large. That's what voters care about. So in my first book, I talk about how they do this through the way they talk about policy issues and by making promises. So just quick data, that on each of these bars, I'm asking whether or not they think a candidate will be committed to gun control or effective on that particular issue. And what I find is that when candidates make an actual promise and imbue action to an issue when they're talking about it, that voters think that they're going to be more committed to that particular issue. And the results are really, really strong. So voters are looking to see exactly how candidates are talking about issues. But I'm saying as well, continuing the argument, that it's not just about how candidates are talking about the issues, that there are other pieces of information that voters might use to determine whether or not candidates are going to act in their best interest. And so I think descriptive representation is about commitment also. And what might that mean? Well, Nadia Brown has a lot of work that talks about how shared lived experience is a really key piece of information that voters are looking for in their candidates. And particularly when we're talking about descriptive representatives, and in her case, she's looking at state government and African-American women, this shared lived experience could be a heuristic for how voters who determine might be a good representative. So then the assessments that these voters are making are not simply about these classifications about identity, right? It's not just about whether or not you look like me. It's about whether or not you and I have a shared attitude about a particular set of issues. And this shift in perspective, what I'm saying is that what I'm trying to argue, that this shift in thinking about not just the shared identity, but shared commitments makes room for us to think even broader than we might about just racial group. So we can start to theorize around what intersectional identities mean, why we might see intragroup mobilization, and what about in-group members who do not substantively represent their in-group, which we also see a la Ben Carson or Herman Cain. Right. So we have three main hypotheses here. First, we think that issues will be of primary importance in determining candidate selection, regardless of a candidate's identity. Second, we want to argue that identity will also matter as a marker of increased representation and trust, right? So it isn't just about the issue. Identity is still going to matter because it's going to increase the idea that this person will be more trustworthy to carry out a group's interests. But what we're also arguing is that for a candidate to really see the strongest levels of support, we'll see both an alignment between both identity and alignment on issues that they think are representative of a group. Okay, so I told you I'm going to talk about three data pieces. The first one is really just a descriptive survey response. We simply ask voters, when you choose your representatives, what features are important to you? And we ask them to rate 7 features on the importance from very important to unimportant on these particular set of issues. So for descriptive representation, if that's the only type of representation operating, we would anticipate that group membership would be an important factor in choosing one's representation. And for substantive representation, we might think that factors based on policy positions would be the most important factors based on the representation. Okay, so we have two categories of questions we ask about. We ask for the identity questions. We ask about how important a shared racial background is or a shared gender. For positions, we ask several different ways that positions might matter to them. whether or not a candidate prioritizes the same issues, if they talk about what they'll do if they're elected, if they take the same positions, and if they share the same party. I'll say we also ask about whether or not they share the same values, and this one to me is kind of in the middle of both types of representation based on how they're theorized. Um, and and we've asked this question actually on a lot of different samples. We get similar results among each. The data I'm sharing with you today is to 1,200 on 3 separate collections on the same day. So I'm looking at 3 different oversamples of each group, 1,200 Black, 1,200 Latinx, and 1,200 white US adults in October 2020. So just days before that election. And each sample was census matched within their racial group or ethnic group on age, gender, and region. Okay, so here's the results, and I'll zoom in on the identity. I'm recognizing it's probably really small from where you're sitting. On that y-axis or the x-axis, I have the mean importance. So all of this has been normalized to a 0 to 1 scale. And then on the x-axis, we have the actual question that was asked. And each of the lines represents a different racial group. So what we'll notice first is that the identity-based features were the lowest rated for all groups writ large, and these top features were all issue-based, and they seem to be the most important across all groups. Oops. Okay. All right, so here I'm zooming in on the issue-based responses. So gender is the top one, race is the second. The triangle represents the white respondents, and this is the only time I'm posting white data because most of this talk is going to be based on Latinx and Black respondents. And what we can see is for everybody, this was rated more unimportant than important, and that we see that the identity features are more important for both Black and Latinx respondents, and least important for white respondents. And let's see, I apologize for not zooming in, but we also don't see a lot of racial group differences between Black and Latinx, or sorry, between Black and white voters when we look at the issues. So whether or not they think position is important, whether or not they prioritize the same issues, whether or not they make promises, or that they share the same party. Even though we're seeing that on all of these Latinx voters rate them less important than the other 2 groups, these are still the features that they say are most important when they go to choose a candidate in elections. Okay, this is just a quick descriptive question, but I think we still learn a few things from it. So when we directly ask, voters aren't more likely to use identity as a feature in selecting a candidate, even if we see some interesting variation between the racial and ethnic groups here. And though Black and Latinx voters are more likely to choose representation based on identity features, Black voters are also more likely to say substantive features matter in choosing representation than our Latinx voters, but both groups are more likely to say these substantive issues are more important than the descriptive issues. There's some, I won't go into it here, but there's some really interesting gender differences when I break it down by gender. In particular, I find that white men are actually the most likely to say that race and gender matter when I break it up by race and gender, to the point where their responses actually align with how Black and Latinx groups say that they use identity, which I think is pretty interesting. Okay, so the second study is a survey experiment. And we wanted to do this because while I think the descriptive survey data is interesting and important, there's some really interesting covariance, it is also descriptive data, right? People may not really tell us how they feel. And it also doesn't really let us think about the ways in which these types of representation might work together, right? Like how might we use both these features at the same time to make our decisions, right? Which is how voters are going to be operating with the data. And we're curious to think about which of these features are mattering the most for voter approval, trust, and representation. Okay, so similarly for descriptive representation, we're anticipating that these identity features would be emphasized more. For substantive representation, we anticipate that information about issues are going to be used more. Okay, so in this experiment, we placed it on the collaborative multiracial post-election survey. Um, it's a very large omnibus survey. It's fielded to about 20,000 US adults. And the reason that that number is so high is because there are oversamples of all types of groups, Black, Latinx, Asian, Native American, Alaskan, and Hawaiian, as well as to white adults. There are also oversamples of Muslims and LGBTQ plus individuals. And so the data that I'm focusing on here in the presentation today is going to just be the Black and Latinx sample, even though in the larger project we'll dig in across all these different racial groups. And it's a great data collection because it allows us to analyze these questions to groups who we usually don't get to survey, and particularly not in these quantities. So what we can do then, because I have so many people, is we can deliver a vignette experiment, but it's modeled after conjoint styled experiment. So for those of you who don't do conjoint experiment analysis, typically we get this from marketers. Typically you're asking people to make a comparison between two different objects, two different people, and you introduce multiple attributes, things that you think might be important, and you vary the levels of each of the attributes so you can get a sense of, as we put all this information together, which of these features are the most important. What I'm doing here, however, is not giving a choice or a comparison, but I'm giving, because I have so many people in my sample, I'm actually just asking about a single individual, and I'm using a similar styled profile where I'm able to vary the race and ethnicity and the issue and the gender of the individual through the information that I'm talking about in the profile. And then I'm really asking people to just tell me what they think just on this individual and not to make the comparison, even though I'm analyzing it as though I would a conjoint. So the name is our tool to indicate gender. It also somewhat it aligns with a Spanish language response, but for the Black and white sample, we leave the name the same, or Black and white candidates, we leave the name the same. And so really the name is mostly about gender. We also indicate this person's racial or ethnic background to be really explicit. We didn't want to use images, but we also want them to not just infer what we think the racial background is just from the name. And so we tell them what the race and ethnicity is. And then we talk about one of three issues. Recycling, which is kind of our baseline issue, we think is not really important or an appeal to a particular racial group. We talk about reforming police departments, which we think is an issue that may matter across different racial groups, but is of particular importance to our Black respondents. And then similarly, we talk about making it easier for immigrants to attain access to services in their communities, which we think will be most important to Latinx groups, though may matter across racial groups as well. And so what we do is we use all this information, randomly assign everyone who takes the survey a single profile. And we say the candidate name, so I'll just pick one. So Yasmin is a Latina candidate running for the House of Representatives in your district. She promises to enact a policy reforms to help your community that will do X. And then we list the policy, either recycling or reform police departments or make it easier for immigrants to attain services. And then we ask 6 questions to try and understand how this candidate profile may matter or may be understood by the respondent. So we ask about their overall support, their alignment on interests, how well they think the individual will represent them, if they'll actually achieve the policy they talked about, and if they'll represent people like you or people like your group. And the group we use is the group that they identify most with. So there's a variety of ways that they can identify. Okay, so here's what we found. In these results, I'm just looking at everything all together. On the x-axis, we have the effect of the treatment. And on the y-axis, we have the actual attributes. So they're grouped into the actual promise on the top part, the race and ethnicity, and then gender on the bottom. And so on the left, I have the Black sample. On the right, I have the Latinx sample. And what we can see is that for both Black and Latinx voters, that issue is a key feature, right? It's positive and significant, indicating that that issue is something that they're using to make their decisions. But we're also seeing that the race of the candidate matters as well. So Black and Latinx voters do not differentiate, according to this, on their vote based on Black and Latinx voters. So they're looking across race at each other and looking kind of at a shared person of color identity. But they do think that white candidates will be much less likely to represent them. And both groups think that women are going to be more likely to represent them. So there's some really interesting parallels to what we find from other literatures. But the biggest observation that we're able to make from this is that the issues seem to be mattering at the same time as race does, but race isn't operating in a way that makes race is not the only factor, and neither are the issues the only factor. Sorry, let me get my straight. Okay. I'm going to skip just to this question of whether or not they think that they would represent them individually. Here, we don't see very much movement on the issues themselves. Immigration and police seem to stay quite similar to that recycling baseline. We see very slight positive shifts in the owned issue. So for Latinx individuals, immigration is slightly positive. For Black individuals, reforming the police is slightly positive. But here we see that the individuals from the other race are viewed as less likely to represent a voter. Which again suggests that when we're thinking about whether or not they're going to be a good representative, the issue matters maybe a little bit, but it's mostly about identity. Okay, I'm going to skip over just in the sake of time. Yeah.
Did you, sorry, I was just wondering if you, maybe I missed this, if you indicated what party the candidate was.
Oh, that's a good question. We did not manipulate party on this, and I didn't, partly because we didn't want to make that extra cut, but partly because we thought, at least for immigration and policing, it was really obvious what the answer would be. And so we didn't. I think that's one thing we're going to follow up on party. I will say too, in my book, I think the only thing it would shift is that recycling baseline. And so I have to think if that should change the results, but I think, yeah, I think so there's also some interesting, people are also inferring party from races as well. And so I think we're kind of struggling of whether or not we wanted to conflict, like having a Black Republican talking about reforming the police, and that would, like, that's just probably not something that will happen. Like it could, but it's strange. So yeah, I think we need to do another additional study to pull out the partisanship for sure. Okay, so I'm kind of skipping over things because I'm noticing time and talking a lot. So we can talk more about what we're finding here. But the baseline is this: when we analyze all of these features in aggregate, in-group candidates are chosen more often than out-group candidates for both Black and Latinx candidates. And I'm saying chosen, really what I should say is they have more support. Issues and identity matter in points of voter selection. We see that it's very clear, but identity seems to matter primarily when deciding if the candidate could represent people like me. So we're seeing both of these features mattering. And then in the analysis that I skipped over, when we analyze these things separately, in-group candidates with group-owned issues were preferred to those without. So we are seeing some evidence that substantive representation is really important as how descriptive representation is being interpreted. Okay, I'm going to skip over these interview responses because I don't think I have time to go into them. But really, the interview responses are really rich because I think they're helping us tell the story with more nuance. Because when we're talking to people, we're able to see some of these features um, that they're using to prioritize the voting. So all these interviews were conducted in 2021. And I'll just say, so most often, what we're seeing is that people were identifying that issues were really important to them when they're going to select the candidate. And they want to find someone who cares about the same set of issues as them, but their identity is also informing what issues are important. So we saw, even if it wasn't the same type of immigration or police reform discussion, we also saw things talking about child labor laws, about the economy, about taxes, about education. And even if some of these things might not be what we would call a group-owned issue or an issue important to a group, people were still picking up on this connection that how their group would benefit and how they as a member of that group would benefit from improving that particular issue. I think what we also saw that was important is that identity seemed to be facilitating trust on which issues would be prioritized. So, just some people voicing this idea that, if a white man came into power and did all these things that I wanted him to do, she had just given us a list of what was important to her. I would think he understood that the cycle of violence was perpetuated by oppression, and he's trying to alleviate that oppression. So yeah, I guess I would have faith in him, but I cannot imagine that scenario. Someone else talking about how Biden, he could be a good representative. He's fine, but he's an old white man. It's not his fault, but he's just not going to understand my experience. So this idea that there is a trust for someone who has been through a similar experience, and that itself translates into these actual issues. I think the other thing that was striking is that when these individuals were talking about what a good representative was and what it meant, they saw these descriptive representatives as not just good for them and their own group, but good for everybody, right? So a good representative would look at factors that affected everyone. Let's see, I'm trying to find the quote here. Yeah, so in talking about Kamala Harris and the good she would do if she were elected, I think she'll be not just for us, I think she'll be a better representative for everyone. And so this idea that there's a transcendence of who these people are representing, and they're not seeing these representatives as just representatives of their own in-group, but representatives for everybody. And I also want to point out that even in our interviews, and we have to unpack this, we also saw some distrust of in-group candidates, which is not a conversation that we often had within descriptive representation, because there what we see is policing of identity, right? So whether or not someone is really a member of a racial group or an ethnic group. But what we saw here is clear acceptance, right? Kamala is definitely a Black woman according to this person, but she's suspicious of what she's going to do because of her record and her work with the prison and justice system in California. So I think what we learned from all these interviews is that it's complicated, right? These types of representation are very much intertwined together. And again, while identity matters, there's some qualifications to how it matters, right? It can establish trust. It's not universally rewarded. But race and ethnic identities do inform the issues that are important. And I think it's also important to say that they were not the only identities. Even in this group of Latinx and African American individuals, they weren't the only identities that they thought were important, right? So everyone we talked to identified first with the race and ethnic group, but we also saw people saying like, I am a Black senior citizen, nobody cares about our issues, so I care about issues that affect senior citizens first and foremost. Someone else talked about issues that affected class. So we also need to be more expansive on the types of identifications that people are talking about politically, because it isn't just race and ethnicity as well. Okay, so I think we can conclude 3 things from this. As we see more voters and candidates from historically excluded communities, I would argue that we need a more precise understanding of how voters are using descriptive representation. And I think centering identity as a shared commitment allows us to develop a more expansive theory. It allows us to talk about intersectional identity, allows us to talk about a range of prioritizations. It allows us to talk about intergroup coalitions. And so I think as we can shift from this idea about not what descriptive representation does, but how descriptive representation matters to voters and in what circumstances. And I think just in closing, one of this older Black woman, I think this quote just is really, for me, what is so interesting about the work that I do. And I think it's just this idea that choosing candidates means balancing multiple sets of information. And she said, I can't say that there's a candidate that I fully identify with, just bits and pieces there, commitments and just expressions here and there. And so voters are very much looking for ways to understand that someone's going to support their issues, to care about them and enact what they care about, but it's complex. So, all right, thank you. And I can take questions.